Hi, welcome back to Explanation Pro. Today we will recap a drama, thriller movie called Misery. Spoiler alert. Watch out and take care. The movie begins with a man writing down on a typewriter. The man is Paul Sheldon, a famous novelist who has been acclaimed because of the bestseller series Misery. However, Sheldon is fed up with this character and prefers to move on to a different type of book. So, he publishes one last Misery novel and moves on to a different book. In a wooden shack in Silver Creek, Sheldon puts the final words to this new book. It's ready to be revised and published once and for all. He takes his car and drives to meet his publishing agent. However, the route is a danger for any driver because there's a threatening blizzard. Sheldon drives as carefully as he can, but to no avail. Eventually, he slips off the highway. The car falls through the mountain and crashes against the snow. Sheldon damages his head severely, and his nose bleeds. As a result, he faints inside the car. Luckily, a stranger finds the crashed car and rescues Sheldon. Sheldon wakes up in a bed in a room, but it's no hospital room whatsoever. In fact, it's a normal bedroom of a farmhouse. When Sheldon opens his eyes, he finds a woman taking care of him. This woman's name is Annie, and she's the one that saved Sheldon's life. Sheldon is wounded everywhere. His legs are broken, and his shoulder is dislocated. But, since Annie is a nurse, she was able to treat Sheldon assertively. Annie explains that she didn't take Sheldon to a hospital because the blizzard is so huge that it blocked the road. What's more, the telephone lines are all cut out, so there's no way to contact an ambulance, even if the blizzard ceased. Lastly, Annie confesses that she's a big fan of Sheldon's novels. More precisely, she adores the character Misery in all the books in the series. Annie also finds Sheldon's manuscript of his new novel and gently asks if she can take a look at it. Naturally, Sheldon agrees. Sheldon's agent realizes his client is missing, so she gets worried and calls the sheriff. The sheriff, then, writes the author's name down and begins his search. So, he drives to the shack where Sheldon was working before the accident, to find any clue or information regarding the writer's disappearance. Back in the farmhouse, Annie is still taking care of Sheldon. She spoon-feeds Sheldon since he's barely able to move a single muscle. Nonetheless, the situation gets tense when Annie expresses her discontent with Sheldon's new novel. She gets so mad that she seems to be out of her mind, spilling soup over Sheldon's bed and screaming like a madwoman. In the end, she slows down and strongly apologizes for her behavior. The sheriff and his wife keep looking for the missing writer. They discover a broken tree that looks suspicious. In other words, it seems like a clue regarding Sheldon's accident. When the sheriff discovers there's nothing more to look for, he leaves the scene of the accident, completely missing Sheldon's car covered in the snow. Meanwhile, Annie is over the moon with the newest release of Misery. She's expecting to read it and enjoy it as much as the other novels. She also explains to Sheldon that her husband passed away some time ago and that the Misery novels helped her during the hard times. Annie seems to be much calmer now. Unfortunately, everything changes when she finishes reading the new edition of Misery. She realizes Misery dies at the end of the novel and doesn't like the event at all. So, she approaches Sheldon and shakes his legs as hard as she can, causing him lots of pain. Annie also screams and smashes objects all around the room. On top of that, Annie confesses she never called Sheldon's agent or any other relative to tell of his accident. This event makes Sheldon realize he needs to escape the farmhouse as soon as possible. So, when Annie leaves the house, Sheldon does his best to move. Unfortunately, he's still wounded, and he falls from the bed to the floor. He crawls toward the door but realizes it's locked, so there's not much Sheldon can do about it. The next morning, Annie returns home and places Sheldon back on his bed. The nightmare doesn't stop there. Despite Annie apologizing for her behavior, she takes a grill inside the bedroom and places Sheldon's script on the top. Then, she covers the new book script with alcohol and takes a match out. Annie orders Sheldon to burn his own book. Needless to say, Sheldon opposes, that is, until Annie bathes his bed with alcohol and threatens to burn him alive. Sadly, Sheldon has no alternative but to burn his work. Sheldon watches the novel he worked so hard on burn into ashes. Therefore, he decides to pay Annie back. He opens a small hole inside his pillow and places the medicine that Annie was providing him with. Days pass by and Sheldon ends up getting a wheelchair, so now he has some freedom for movement. Annie brings a typewriter into the room and places it on the table. Annie's wish is for Sheldon to write a brand new Misery novel where the character is still alive. While Annie is talking about her idea, Sheldon finds a hairpin lying on the floor. Needless to say, he considers it for a future plan. What will he do with it? Sheldon, then, gently tells Annie that the papers she bought for him are poor quality and that he needs a different one to work on the new Misery novel. Unsurprisingly, Annie finds it offensive and hits Sheldon in the legs once again. Then off she goes to get the paper. Sheldon seizes the opportunity and grabs the hairpin he found before. With it, he successfully opens the locked door and is able to move through the living room. In a futile attempt to contact the police, Sheldon uses the telephone, which is not functioning. He then finds a box full of pills, so he takes a pack and hides it in his clothes. All of a sudden, though, he hears Annie's car approaching the house, so Sheldon rushes to the room. Luckily, he makes it to the room just in time for Annie's return. Of course, Sheldon is heavily sweating, which Annie finds suspicious. Sheldon's excuse is that he's in severe pain, so he asks Annie for more medicine. Back to the sheriff, he discovers that Sheldon's car is covered in snow. Everyone concludes Sheldon is dead, either because of a wild animal or some other natural event. That is until the sheriff discovers the car's door has been opened with a tool. To be more precise, this makes the sheriff consider that Sheldon was rescued by someone. Meanwhile, in the house, Sheldon pours the pill's content into an envelope. The next day, Sheldon shows Annie the first drafts of Misery's new novel. Annie finds it quite amusing and feels happy. So, Sheldon proposes to Annie to have dinner together, and Annie agrees. Annie and Sheldon have dinner and drink wine. When Annie gets up and heads somewhere else, Sheldon pours the medicine into Annie's glass. Worse luck, Annie returns and spills her glass of wine all over the table, so Sheldon's plan was completely futile. From that point onwards, Sheldon keeps working on Misery's novel. All the while, the sheriff reads Sheldon's novels to see if he can find a clue somehow. Also, Sheldon lifts the typewriter every now and then to regain some strength in his arms. One night, Annie confesses to Sheldon that she's in love with him. Then Annie takes a revolver out of her pocket, just to threaten Sheldon. Finally, Annie leaves in her car. Sheldon takes his chances and reaches to the kitchen, where he grabs a knife to protect himself. He also takes a look all around the house and finds a book full of newspaper pages, containing publications of Annie. It turns out that Annie was indeed a nurse, but she caused lots of infant deaths. If there was any doubt regarding Annie's sanity, this event just dissipated every doubt. Sheldon returns to his bed, only to wake up in the middle of the night and find Annie staring at him. The woman injects a needle into Sheldon's arm and the writer faints. The next day, Sheldon wakes up and finds himself tied to the bed. Annie realized Sheldon has been sneaking into the house. On top of that, Annie found both the kitchen knife and the hair clip that Sheldon was hiding. The nurse has no choice but to break Sheldon's leg with a hammer, to prevent him from fleeing. One day, Annie drives to a store. There, the sheriff spots her. He immediately recognizes the woman's face from somewhere. The sheriff goes back to his personal notes and discovers Annie's newspaper articles, telling about her crimes. That newspaper article contains a very specific quote that Annie said. It turns out that that quote is taken from one of Misery's novels. In other words, this makes the sheriff suspect Annie. So, the sheriff follows Annie and makes it to the farmhouse. Sheldon spots the sheriff and believes he's finally going to be rescued. That is until Annie breaks into the room and injects Sheldon with a drug. Annie then hides Sheldon's sleeping body in the basement. Then, she makes the sheriff pass in to check the house. Since the sheriff doesn't find anything strange, he decides to leave. However, Sheldon wakes up and makes noises with the grill. The sheriff hears this rattle and heads back to the house once more. The sheriff opens a secret door and finds Sheldon at the bottom of the stairs. Will he be rescued once and for all? Unfortunately, Annie appears from behind and shoots the sheriff dead with a shotgun. After that, Sheldon convinces Annie on writing the end of the new Misery novel before the police officers come to look for the sheriff, as an excuse to save his own life. Nonetheless, when Annie leaves, Sheldon grabs a can of alcohol and hides it in his clothes. Eventually, Sheldon finishes the novel and gently asks Annie for wine and a cigarette to celebrate. Annie brings the goods, including a match to light the cigarette. Then, Sheldon asks Annie to bring a cup for herself to celebrate together. When Annie leaves the room, Sheldon pours the alcohol on Misery's script. Annie returns to the room only to find Sheldon setting the novel on fire. Annie, of course, desperately jumps right into the pages to put the fire off. Suddenly, Sheldon grabs the typewriter and with all his might, smashes the machine against Annie's head. Annie grabs her gun and shoots at Sheldon's arm. Fortunately, the writer is still able to jump toward Annie and place the burned pages inside Annie's mouth. The evil woman stands up in pain, slips, and hits her head against the typewriter, causing her death. Sheldon then crawls out of the room, but Annie, who is still alive, grabs the man from behind. Sheldon is fast and grabs a small statue, which uses to hit Annie in the head. This time, though, Annie dies for real, once and for all. Time passes by and we find a healthier Sheldon alive and walking in the streets of New York. Although he finds it hard to walk properly, he couldn't be happier. He has regained his freedom. Sheldon eventually meets his agent to have lunch. The woman suggests Sheldon write a novel regarding his experience with Annie. Understandably, Sheldon is still too traumatized to write a book about the event. Then, a waitress approaches Sheldon's table. At first sight, Sheldon believes she's Annie. Needless to say, this was just Sheldon's trauma kicking in. The woman was no other but a waiter offering cake to Sheldon. The movie ends with the waitress telling Sheldon that she's a huge fan of his work. Sheldon smiles back, but deep down, he's still scared. Thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe to stay updated.